Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Youthcast. Today is Thursday, the 20th of October, and we've got a lot to talk about today. It's been a very eventful couple of weeks. I mean, we weren't on air last week, unfortunately, but we're back, and we've got a show full of
full house today.
We've got a full house, and we've got a show which is going to be jam-packed of very interesting things to talk about. Obviously, I'm sure as a lot of the listeners have heard that there's been a resignation, a couple of resignations. We're all so upset.
Yeah.
Indeed, it's been happening. But let's just introduce today's participants. We have the usual Tariq.
Tariq, guys, great to be here.
We have someone new. We have Isaac.
It's a great opportunity to be with you guys. Thank you for your invitation.
Absolutely. Razin.
Yep, we're here as usual. Alhamdulillah.
And we've got, lastly,
Amar. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope you're doing well.
We have got Amar. So we've got a full house today. We've got 5 people here on the show, and we've got a lot to talk about. So let's get into it. So obviously, as I just mentioned in the intro,
major changes to the
political infrastructure of this country. So obviously, we're going to start on that. This is the Youthcast. We'd like to give the youth opinion on general news and current affairs. So today is the 20th of October, Thursday. This is a very key moment in the history of politics in the UK. So I think it's very important that we start on what's happened today.
Let's report on the facts first, and then we'll give our own opinions.
So obviously, there's been quite a few resignations recently in the Tory party and in.
Okay, so we'll start from since we missed last week's show. We'll start from what happened just before. So obviously, the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, we obviously know what that led to. So his resignation over the whole mini budget failure. Yeah. So what do you think about that, lads?
I think it was pretty catastrophic, and I think it was pretty poorly executed. Yeah, in his methodology, and I think, I don't really think he should have been resigned as quickly as he did, because I feel like, although it was his fault, he is the Chancellor. A lot of the blame was not sort of equally spread. I mean, if you look at Lizz Truss, she was sort of the proprietor and pushing this sort of agenda that Kwasi Kwarteng eventually did obviously create, and then she sort of held back and then put all the responsibility on him and felt like it was her sort of role to fire him, although she sort of encouraged him to do what he did.
I mean, I think that is a pretty decent viewpoint, but then again, you look at the economy and see how the pound has just plummeted. And then it's just really unforgivable, isn't it?
Good news, actually. It's actually risen.
Yeah, really?
As it risen, just
as she resigned, it rises. Wow.
Wow, man.
It's crazy. You know it's at the moment.
I think.
Can we get a figure on that?
€1. I was looking at Yahoo Finance, and it was coming up as around 115, which is kind of, it's 114.63, which is kind of a boost from what it was this morning. And I think it's interesting to see how markets are reacting to her resignation, because it's like bringing more trust into the resignation and how her mini budget delivered, and then how the pound plummeted, because she delivered the mini budget.
Yeah.
But where was that money going to come from?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then it showed kind of like
borrowing.
Yeah, it's just crazy, yeah.
So we've got wise words from our economy student.
It's coming in clutch right there.
Less trust, more trust.
Yeah, I was literally gonna say, I knew one of you was gonna make that joke. Trust and trust. That pun was right there.
It just writes itself together.
By the way, the pound is equal to $1.12.
That is an improvement.
I think the lowest it got to.
The lowest was 108,
108 or something disastrous like that.
But there's another pun that we want to talk about, that we were fighters and
So can we get an exact quote on that? What were the exact words on yesterday's PMQs?
So for the listeners out there, the former Prime Minister, we can now call her, yesterday in the House of Commons said that she is not a fighter and she's not a quitter. But obviously
the following day we all know what happened.
So I believe that's the exact quote.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
That is the exact quote. So that is what happened yesterday, and obviously we all know what's happened today. So it's just sort of, to be honest, when you watch these clips of the politicians arguing in the House of Commons, it's like a comedy show.
It just reminds you of like a football stadium.
These people are in charge of running the country, and the way they just interact with each other is not professional.
I genuinely believe someone perhaps in the future we'll create a sitcom of just it will be a perfect sitcom. I would watch that.
Honestly.
You know, like just Boris Johnson, just a character.
Yeah.
You know, Rishi Sunak, and then Liz Truss saying that one day, and the next day resigning.
I think it's interesting because it's basically what happened with Boris Johnson, it's just a different circumstance, but it's basically the same thing. So, you know, she's resigning as Conservative Party leader. Now they have another, you know, like election process for a new Conservative Party leader. So it's just same thing happening over and over again. And it's in you know, when a cost of living crisis is happening in the UK.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think about that? Like, it's happening right now.
We need good leadership. You know,
Yeah.
perhaps one of the prime times that we need good leadership, steadfast leadership.
Okay, here's a
People
question.
deliver.
Whose fall from grace was worse? So was it Boris Johnson with his Partygate scandal, or Liz Truss and the whole economic crisis? What do you think?
Liz Truss without a doubt.
Liz Truss.
You guys
Boris
think-
Johnson.
Nah.
Boris
Okay, here's
Johnson,
the debate then.
Other side of the turret.
Boris Johnson was a
He
lot more.
didn't- Boris Johnson had a fall from grace. This Truss just had a fall.
Do you know what? I would agree with Tariq there. I think
she
memories
had a
are very
legacy.
quick to forget how bad Johnson's demise was. Just think about it. The whole Partygate scandal was going on for weeks and weeks, and then eventually when he resigned, it was like, well, everyone was obviously happy that it happened.
Yeah.
But then now, with Liz Truss, you have like a similar sentiment that's been echoed, but again, I don't think it's as bad as how Johnson got it.
I thought you were talking about what was more tragic.
I was talking about what was I talking about?
Whichever had the most sort of, which I think
The
which was
bigger
more
reaction.
dramatic, which was more
Yeah.
cinematic.
Yeah, but
That's
Boris
definitely Liz
Johnson had
Truss.
a
Of
whole-
course it
I
was.
think myself,
Look how quick it was.
yeah, I think myself,
That's
I would
worse.
probably say Liz Truss,
It's like an action movie.
especially her budget. Like economically, it does not like make sense.
Yeah.
Right when inflation is going higher, right now, yesterday I think it was announced by the ONS that inflation is 10.1%.
Whoa.
Massive difference between what the target is of 2%, and how she's making, you know, economic policies about, you know, borrowing, all this stuff like mortgage, less tax, cutting tax. Okay, that was, and then she just stopped it all. Everything got reversed. But it's interesting because when you cut in tax, especially for the rich, 45%, she was going to put it to 40%. That's increasing spending. When you increase spending, inflation goes higher. She's not what is she? Her current economic policies are not. She's not dealing with, you know, people with low income, and she's not dealing with inflation. What she's dealing about is just, you know, just like
For short-term
tax,
causes.
like, where's the growth coming from? You know, she needs to focus on people with low income. You know, those who are going through. You know, there's people right now in, you know, in our community everywhere. Like they're thinking, oh, can I put the electricity on tomorrow? Can I put the heater on? And then all she's thinking about is about the people that are on the highest tax rate, 45% to 40%. Like, why does that make sense?
I think she had very idealistic goals
Yeah,
for the
true.
future,
Perhaps,
which she was
yeah.
trying to tackle
He was quite facts right in that sense.
a lot. To maybe she was like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do this, long-term economy, all this, and then she forgot what the necessities of the actual country were,
Mm.
which is why she has. She's not in power anymore.
I think something related to what you were saying, Isaac, is a study I read in the Guardian, and when you think about it, it makes total sense. For every £1 spent on the NHS, you get £4 of growth. This is a study that was conducted over the in the UK over the last couple of years or whatever,
Yeah.
and it makes sense. When you put money into the NHS, you're putting money into nurses' pockets. You're putting money into companies and hospitals and people. Right, and that will innately grow the economy around those
course.
people. I think there's a sentiment, especially nowadays when the economy is doing poorly, there's a sentiment of the story of austerity, of pull back spending. I don't think that's the best. It's not always the best technique moving forward. Simply because if you want to grow the economy, you have to put money into the economy. You have to make money. You have to put money to make money.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of thing. And growth requires investment. It requires confidence, and you don't get that through austerity. You don't get that through cutting wages. You don't get that through hurting people, and hurting communities. And like Isaac said, there's a very, very, very real human effect that this has, on people all over the world. All over the UK, but specifically here in Luton as well. We aren't the richest town. We can't lie to ourselves. We aren't the richest town. Neither are our surrounding areas, and we have a lot of people who are going to struggle much more than the people who Liz Truss has cut taxes for or attempted to cut taxes for. So I think it's good that she's out. But
Of course.
it's a situation of who's behind though. We said the same thing when Boris Johnson was out, and look who went behind him.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of how much can you really come to expect from the party that has, quite clearly let down the population of the UK multiple times.
I think you made a good point there about how people have very real problems. Sometimes when you watch these politicians, it's like they live in cloud cuckoo land. If I'm being honest,
Exactly.
Yeah.
they sort of ignore so many real problems, and they just focused on very sort of these long-term, very far-fetched goals about growing the economy, etc., etc. But they miss that a lot of the populace of this country right now, especially, is struggling, and I feel like they fail to recognize that their job as leaders is to lead and guide
Mhm.
people out of a difficult time.
Of course.
Especially the time that Liz Truss entered, that was her job. That should have been her main focus, not all this tax cut, all this drama that's been happening in the House of Commons, and even from other politicians as well. If you
Yeah.
look at the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, I feel like they weren't really helping the situation, if I'm being honest. It's just a back and forward, back and forward.
Yeah.
And they're not really addressing the real issue here of what's been happening in the country in general. It's just
I think
it's
with
a
the Labour
game for
Party
them.
and Keir Starmer, what you see is that for the Labour Party to benefit, they only succeed off of the Conservative Party's downfall. So
Yeah.
it's not like you don't see Starmer having his own ambitions that people maneuver towards. It's just people see how bad the Tory Party is doing, and we say, okay, you know what? Tory Party is doing terribly. Let's go with Labour. So it's more of that, and you've seen that for the last decade or so, especially with the Labour Party wilderness years. They obviously haven't been in power for the last. It's been like 5 prime ministers now, hasn't it? And it's going to be number 6 with the new prime minister that gets reinstated. But yeah, I like what you were saying, Musin, about how these politicians that we have, especially in the Commons, they're not really. They're quite idealistic with how they behave with their policies, and I would say that that's sort of accountable to the sort of ivory tower they sit on, because obviously think about where these people are educated, private schools, where they live. It's like they're in the highest tax brackets. Remind me, who was the richest MP?
Rishi Sunak. I
Rishi
believe.
Sunak.
Yeah, and we all know what happened with the scandal surrounding the Sunak family. So you see that these MPs, especially in the Tory party, they can't, due to their like ivory tower background, they can't really relate to the working class person who, like Isaac was saying, they're thinking about whether they can turn on the gas tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because I think there's an interesting sort of idea of what would make the best leader. So what sort of background would make the best leader? I think some people innately say the most educated, the most, the most intelligent, most educated person would make the best leader. But something interesting that I read about is that it's possible that the opposite can sometimes help.
Of course.
Being not knowing anything
Mm-hmm.
can help a lot, because if, for example, I took a random person
Mm-hmm.
and I deleted all his memories and I told him, "You're prime minister now," he does, and the next day he'd have to go back to his former life, but he doesn't remember what his former life is.
Yeah.
He is going to have the goal of making sure every single sector of society improves, because he doesn't know which sector of society he's going to find himself in. He might he might cut taxes for the rich,
Yeah.
but then he won't be rich, and then all of a sudden it'll hurt
It's
him.
quite interesting.
He might help the poor, but he might help the poor and kill all the rich, but then he might be rich, and that won't help him either. So his one goal will be trying to help the most amount of people possible to maximize his chance of being helped himself. So I think that's the sort of mentality we should be having. It might not be too much of an issue to sort of say we don't need the most intelligent, we don't need the most educated. We need some people who are able to relate to us. We need people who are from our communities, who know who we are, who know how we work, and know how the British people, what the British people want. And I think that's what we need much more than
What we're being offered.
Yeah, what we're being offered than these Eton elites, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
I fully agree with that, but I think it's very unlikely that something like that will actually happen, especially with the party that's currently in power. I don't think we're gonna get just a working class leader anytime soon,
So
or someone who has values likened to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it's interesting because the UK is so like I was looking into it like a few weeks ago, how it's more of a two-party kind of thing. There's no other parties that can kind of win. And then it was interesting to see how the UK's always gone. If you look at it historically, like the UK's always gone through a period where it will stay with one party for a while, And then when that party starts crumbling, when that party, you'll see that with Tony Blair, kind of going, to conservatives. So I feel like right now it's at that point where the Conservative Party is like, crumbling, and it's going to go to that next stage of. I don't personally believe that Lib Dems or small parties can kind of win the elections in the UK because it's more of a two-party thing. Like Labour could, potentially, I think right now if you look at the polls and everything, YouGov, all that stuff, they're leading by a massive
march. I think something like 33 points.
It's
a 33% difference. So I think the newest one was 30% difference.
Yeah.
Although I haven't seen them since Liz Truss's resignation, so I wonder how that has affected everything. So I think the question that I want to pose to everyone, and this is a very interesting question that I think about often, is that to what extent, because you were talking about how you don't see it happening in the near future, that we will have a working class leader, a leader who actually relates to the majority of working Britain. And I think the question is not just in the short next couple of weeks, years or so, long term, to what extent do you think that the electoral system we have today, the sentiment and perhaps the factors affecting politics and polling today, to what extent do you think that the people's will is getting across, and to what extent do you think it's going to get across? How effective, in other words, is our democracy? How democratic is our democracy?
Quite an interesting question, actually.
I think it's an important question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, just on that, how effective is our democratic system? So it's certainly something to think about. So if we look at just to make a comparison here, if we look at the US American electoral system, what you see is that they're very two-party. So we obviously have that in the UK, but they're very much Republican or Democrat.
Yeah.
And then what we're seeing in Britain now with British elections is that you're sort of getting the sentiment of the more like the Americanization of British politics in the sense where when people vote, they feel like they're voting for a person rather than a party. So in an American election, it was obviously in the final race in the what was the date? Was it 2020? In the 2020 election, it was obviously between Biden and Trump. So you vote for a candidate, you vote for a person, and then what we're seeing now is there's a sort of shift away from voting for a party rather than voting for a person. When people vote for Tory party, they're thinking, I'm not voting for the entire Conservative Party, I'm voting for Liz Truss.
Yeah.
Equally, when they're voting for Labour, I'm not voting for just Labour, I'm voting for Keir Starmer. So you're seeing parties are becoming individualized with just the leader being the sort of forefront of everything. And I think that's actually quite a problem because if we compare it to the American system, it's obviously not very effective because when you have like a single person that is the sort of, like you said, just the main figure of the entire party, nothing really gets done because all the cabinet ministers are just secondary and the party isn't even considered as highly as it should be.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Especially where you said about how it's not as effective. I think a part of that is because when people are voting for a particular person, it sort of sways their way because as a particular person can gaffe, he can make a mistake, right? And so they can sort of write off anything that happens and say, it's not his fault. Whereas with a party,
the whole party is accountable.
The whole party is truly accountable for
that's
their
true.
actions. And when you vote for a party, you vote for policies.
Yeah.
You say, I believe, if, for example, if you had voted for Conservatives, you might believe in cutting taxes or keeping taxes lower. You might have believed in cutting down the welfare state or whatever opinion you might have had. But and this is very interesting as well because nowadays people don't vote for policies. People don't vote for what
they vote for people
they think is the best. They might vote for whichever candidate they think is the best, or sometimes they vote for the sort of. Sometimes it's identity politics. Sometimes people vote because they see the person in front of them is like them. They believe that they have a similar identity. They must play because they have a similar background to me. They might relate to me more. That's part of why, for example, Rishi Sunak might win.
Yeah,
he might appeal to a demographic who don't see themselves in a lot of other parliamentary candidates. But another thing is that they vote for sort of what have been
like charismatic characters. Is that what you mean?
But not in terms of that. In terms of the policies, so-called policies, there's some. They're called wedge issues.
Okay.
That are what have been called wedge issues. They're sort of small points that parties have blown up in terms of what the differences between them are. So I think one of the most recent ones is the whole debate around sexuality and identity. And that has been sort of blown up where, Labour has been seen as the party that's much more sort of progressive in that manner.
Yeah.
And Conservatives have become the
Conservatives.
in that manner. And so from that, someone might vote for the Conservatives, despite the fact that the policy differences between them are quite on this issue are not particularly different.
So
There's
it's
not
like,
much of a difference.
so just to interject, it's the one policy that's the make or break for the individual.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And it's sort of blown up as a big difference between the two parties. But in reality, parties agree on this particular issue, but they use it as a sort of spat. And it creates a wedge between the two parties, which otherwise isn't really there in that issue. And because of that, people are no longer, again, voting for the policies behind the parties. People aren't going, I'm voting for Conservatives because they have a better policy towards, the sexuality. They're simply saying, I'm voting for Conservatives because the air of what they're saying, the reputation they have, and the sort of general statements they make better aligns with what I feel I want the policies to be. I think that's a dangerous thing related to what you were talking about.
I think what's interesting is also like the UK, when you're talking about kind of the US, how it's, how the election works, the electoral college, all that stuff. So one thing that was really interesting was the UK system is made for just two parties to be like the majority. Like,
spoiler effect.
Yeah, like first past the post is clearly like ineffective right now. Like, because in the US, they kind of have where, states have different kind of electoral...
colleges. They're different weighting.
Yeah. And then, but in here, it's like you got Isle of Wight, which has a massive, they have one, I think the biggest voting, and they get one seat, but then there'll be like small, Hitchin and Harpin, and where they will have one seat as well. Like and it's not even just that, like they made it so like small parties, like the Green Party, Liberal Democrats, all that stuff can't get that many seats. So it's like and there's this saying in politics, it says, if it ain't broken, you don't need to fix it.
Yeah.
So it's like very interesting to see because the major parties like Conservative, Labour, they don't want to like change that up because there's there's such a big
it benefits them so much because if you're a smaller party, you will never succeed on the first past the post because for you to win under a constituency, you have to essentially. So obviously the 650 MPs in the House of Commons, and for a party to win and become the winning party, you need 326. So to get 326, you need to win 326 individual constituencies. And if you're a small party, if you're getting second place in every single constituency, because what you see is Lib Dems and Greens, they actually are successful, but they just aren't successful on a national scale.
Yeah.
They're successful in the sense that, let's say in like a constituency like, I don't know, but like... Harpenden. I'm not familiar, but I think Harpenden's a sort of swing seat between Labour and Lib Dem.
No, it's mostly Conservative. So and then Lib Dems is rising up. Labour is like the bottom of Harpenden and Hitchin. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So is it a swing seat or is it a safe Conservative?
No, it's safety Conservative. But I have a feeling, I was talking to the community, like with like students there. They were saying how Lib Dems rising up. You'll see more banners from like Lib Dems.
I think it's very possible that Lib Dem will win the next.
Like
election.
St Albans went to Lib Dems, so I have a feeling.
I get it. Okay, so I just have a question. So we're obviously talking about parties and their influence, especially under the current electoral system. But do we think that? So obviously in society we have not officially, but we have like we have come to know what's called like the working class and the upper class, right? So do you think classes are still aligned to certain parties? So typically the stereotype is that Labour is for the working class and the Tory party, the Conservative party, is for the upper middle class, right? So now class de-alignment is the idea that people have sort of shifted away, and you see that working class people are now voting Tory, and equally upper class to middle class people are voting Labour. So do we think that people are still aligned to the party that benefits their class, or are we more de-aligning away from that?
That's a very, very, very good point.
I don't think it's to do with classes, because if you look at it and you think that middle class and upper middle class people will vote for Tory, then it would be a clear win for Labour every single time.
That's true, because the working class dominate the franchise. The working class make up the majority of the population.
The majority of the population. I think it goes back to what Tarek was saying. They align similar values of what they feel like. So, for example, a lot of people who are maybe more traditional in that sense would maybe think to vote for Conservative, although, as Tarek said, policies are not too dissimilar in that sense. It's just that they feel that it's a very traditional way of acting. It's very conservative. Like, for example, a lot of them maybe lived through Thatcher's era, and
Yeah.
her sort of
Definitely.
new right politics was very, very sort of traditional. So I think that's why they sort of align themselves with values rather than sort of classist way of
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
things.
yeah.
So listeners, we have around 30 seconds
So
left.
just in the last 30 seconds,
Yeah.
obviously we're in quite a dramatic political climate right now. And I was just reading this tweet. So he's from a Sky News journalist, and he said that my son has lived through 4 chancellors, 3 home secretaries, 2 prime ministers, and 2 monarchs, and he's only 4 months old. So it just goes to show how dramatic
chaos.
the sort of climate of the world is.
But yeah, very good point there. We will continue this conversation after the break, listeners. Thank you for listening, and assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
everyone.
Assalamu alaikum. In Luton and its surrounding areas, it is now time for Salat al-Isha.
लुटन और इसके मज़ाफ़ात में नमाज इशा का वक्त हुआ चाहता है.
This azan has been sponsored by Ideal Properties. Contact us on 01582 721110 or log on to www.idealpropertiesltd.co.uk.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
Would you like to sponsor the azan? If so, give us a call on 01582 481810 or email us on info@inspirefm.org.
From the studios of Inspire FM, The time is now 7:30.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Youthcast. It's the second half of the show, and in the first half we had a very, very interesting discussion with the brothers here about what's been happening in terms of the political situation of the country in recent times. So we talked about Lizz Truss, what's been happening with her policies, the Chancellor, etc., etc. We talked about a lot of things, and I feel like we made some very, very important points.
Yeah.
So just to recap,
Yeah,
how do you think the conversation went?
I think it was a great conversation. We spoke about a lot of different things. I think some of the high notes that we had, more specifically, of course, we talked about Lizz Truss resigning. I think we talked a lot about how the politics in the UK is changing, how the sentiment among people is changing. We talked about how classes nowadays don't necessarily vote for their class, in that, the traditional sense of how classes were supposed to vote is no longer the case. We talked about how we have a different way of voting now as well, and the way in which that voting affects things. So I think it was a great conversation.
Yeah. In the break, we were just talking about how Tarek, why don't you remind us what we were saying about how media companies sort of control the belief system. So even if we look at like manifestos, so in the previous segment we were talking about how policies aren't actually the make or break between who wins an election.
Yes.
It's more about the character of the leader of the party, as well as like what were those policies called? Like what they call the wedge
issues.
Wedge issues. That's it. So the wedge issues are like the make or break things that people sort of want to vote on, and so we were just saying in the break that these newspaper companies and media companies actually control election turnouts, because what we saw is obviously Rupert Murdoch, he owns many of the major newspaper companies. So we're talking The Sun, The Times, so many of the major newspaper outlets. And what you've seen is that the Sun newspaper, so this is just exclusive to The Sun, since 1992, the Sun newspaper has never incorrectly guessed or backed the winner of an election. So they've always backed whoever came out to be the winner. And it's interesting because either they guessed it, which is just unlikely, because how are you going to guess it? What, in 1992? That's like 20, how many years in a row?
Yeah.
So either they control the elections and whoever they back, people vote for, influence to a large extent, or they're just able to correctly predict it, which is probably the most unlikely.
Yeah.
So what we see is that, so actually in 1992, their headline their election day headline was, it was the Sun what won it. So they're literally saying to themselves that, yeah, it was us that won the election for that party. And so it's interesting. So what do you guys think about the influence of media on elections?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think what I said over the break, and what I'm sure a lot of the listeners will have heard, is that it's a sort of phrase that's spouted a lot, and I don't fully agree with it, but it definitely has some truth to it. And it's if voting made a difference, if voting changed who was in power, then they would never let you vote. I don't 100% agree with that, because people in power have changed, policies have changed, all sorts of things have changed after elections. But they didn't let us vote. We fought for our right to vote.
Yeah.
People died for our right to vote. Women died for their right to vote. We as people fought for our right to vote. So I don't necessarily agree with it.
Honestly, I think that's more of a philosophical issue than a political issue. Like, I think we're talking about the idea of like power and control, and whether democracy and us as individuals in the franchise really have a say. So I think it was Churchill who actually, this is one of his famous quotes, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. So now what he's saying, so obviously he's alluding to the fact that voters aren't usually, well, this is, according to him, voters aren't usually the most aware of what the correct decision is
definitely.
in terms of who to vote for. And this links back into the fact that media influences everything. Twitter, Instagram, people don't understand how absolutely influential these sites are.
Yeah, I think what you were talking about, because I think what and the way that people go about this is usually quite a different idea. Is saying, you know, the elections are rigged. You know,
Yeah, very like extreme.
Your vote doesn't matter at all. No.
It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than that. It's a conversation to be had though, and there's a lot of people that have power and influence over our lives and over the country in general. A lot of people. Not all of those are democratically elected, and I would say perhaps even the majority of those are not democratically elected.
Definitely.
You know, as a worker, your boss has a lot of control over you, and of course he's not democratically elected. As an individual who watches TV and who consumes media, the media in the majority of cases is also not democratically influenced in any way, and in a lot of times these can completely decide your life. You know, who your boss is, what media you watch can completely decide your life and can decide the outer political climate. You know, it's not just about Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah.
It's about Instagram. It's about Facebook. It's about, Twitter. These are all very influential sites, which at the click of a button, you know, they could shut down whole communities. They could bring up whole communities. They could change the complete political paradigm. And they do. That's the issue here. So I think there's a conversation to be had that does that mean that our elections aren't particularly useful? Does that mean that they don't change anything? I don't think so. I think they're very useful because they still, to an extent, show some will of the people. But it's also about just because they're useful in showing the will of the people, does that mean the will of the people still happens? You know, I mean, there are plenty of policies which aren't at all, you know, plenty of big policies which are very unpopular. You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Iraq War.
Yeah,
that was one of the most unpopular decisions.
I think that was what lost Blair the election.
Course,
but it happened anyway. You know, and it caused death and destruction for millions of people, and it happened anyway. And it's a question of, you know, should he have that power? Did he have the mandate from the British people to do that? You know, it's questions like that which I think we need to, as a nation, address. And we need to address, you know, if we come to the conclusion that we don't have the power that we think we do, how do we then solve that? And that's what I'm interested to answer.
I think as an average citizen of the UK, you're not going to necessarily know all the political and economical problems of the country and what the prime ministers are putting forth and the people that are going to get elected. So so these citizens, I think when they generally decide to vote on a specific person, they tend to do it according to either what their community thinks of it, or like according to one specific point of view that person puts forth. But then there's also a ton of other major or minor things which also change like a political sense of view, which then also has drastic changes. But then from the average citizen, they're not focused on that because they're focused on specific pinpoints.
I think what's interesting about what you said about, you know, Tony Blair, and it's important to see because the UK is an uncodified constitution, so it's all from different sources. So, and then whereas you see in the US it's codified, so the president has a clear kind of like, you know, job title of what he has to do. And in the UK, there's an issue going on where it's, you know, uncodified, where there's and I was talking about with my politics teacher, and he was saying how, you know, PM in the UK, there's no job description, there's no like, you know, and it's interesting to see when you said Tony Blair, and you can see like how much impact different PMs had and how much, you know, like power they've all had, because some PM, you know, took that into, you know, their own interest, and then some didn't, you know, like Theresa May, she was, you know, because yet, you know, her government had the majority, and you could see it with Tony Blair, like he was very tactical, whereas he, you know, he had like a sofa cabinet where he, you know, he wouldn't really like communicate as much, even though he gets like, you know, landslide and such a big majority. But it's just it's interesting because there's so many things, you know, so many issues going on with our constitution, with the UK's, you know, political system, and it's like, I think it's just even the way votes nowadays are just, it's kind of shifting, you know, with the you know, the young generation, and it's just interesting. I think this is an issue that definitely needs to be talked about. Yeah,
makes a good point. And just you talking about elections, Keir Starmer is actually calling for a general election. So what's your points on that? So
What a surprise.
it's been sort of confirmed that there'll be a leadership election.
Yeah, so within the
But-
next week, we should be having a new prime minister. So currently, Liz Truss has resigned, but in the meantime, she's
still
still officially PM until her successor is announced after the leadership election. But so following Keir Starmer's, he would obviously, as Labour leader, the Conservative Party right now is at its weakest point ever. So for him to, if a general election were to happen now, it would be so beneficial for him and the Labour Party because it would be a landslide win for Labour. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't make sense for the Conservative Party to kind of get that away.
So they obviously I don't think it would be likely to happen, but what you're seeing is a lot of public uproar for it to happen. So it's interesting to see how much public uproar would actually cause an influence on whether the politicians make the decision to actually call a general election.
I mean, it would be quite embarrassing as well. Just over 2 months ago, they had it for Lizz Truss, and then they're doing it again. I mean, if that didn't possibly work, then I think majority of citizens would be thinking to do a general election again with both. But then obviously that then goes out of favor from the Tory party.
So a stat I actually saw, so interesting you say that, a stat I saw is that for the leadership race, obviously it ended up becoming between Sunak and Truss.
Yeah.
The leadership race actually lasted longer than Truss's time in office. So I believe it's 45 days in office, right?
Yeah, 45 days.
And so her race to actually become PM was longer than the time she actually was PM. So it's just very interesting to see these stats and actually, have a laugh about it.
Yeah, I mean, she beat the last prime minister with the shortest time in office by about 74 days.
Wow.
But the thing, but the crazy thing is, he didn't step down; he died.
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
She's a fighter.
Never quit.
And also, I've seen in the news that Boris Johnson is also a potential candidate.
Oh,
Are we all
controversial.
Are we all excited to see the return of?
I think that's quite controversial. But you know what? I think minds are very quickly to forget how politically damaging Johnson was. Like, I don't know what the exact statement is, but in politics, everyone is forgetful. We forget everything. So. Yeah, so people calling for Johnson, it is not a great look because
definitely.
Go ahead.
What you're saying is but I think definitely as if you were a Conservative MP right now, what you'd think right now is who's the best leader, and I don't personally think that MPs are gonna back Boris Johnson because they basically their decision is do they want a job after the because they're basically thinking do they want to keep their jobs, because if basically they vote Boris, they'll definitely know that the public, they don't have trust in him anymore. So it's kind of whereas you have to see, and I'm gonna ask these questions, and I think Tarek probably comment. It's what do you think about Rishi Sunak? What do you think about him as the next PM? Because there's a high chance of him coming to.
Yeah. So Tarek touched on him and the sort of identity politics game.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I'm not too familiar with his policies because obviously in the run-up to the leadership race between Truss and him, there was no one could really tell. I think people were quite split between whether it would be Sunak or Truss. But interestingly, although he lost that leadership race, it actually might be more beneficial for him because if he had become PM, he might be in Truss's position right now.
That's true.
Yeah. I'll say that, and then, but I wouldn't think he would be in Truss's position
because he had different policies,
wise, or even I don't think the markets would have reacted as much because more the market kind of reaction for Truss was way more it was so volatile in a sense, and I think Rishi is more kind of educated economically.
Okay.
Kind of
we got a Rishi supporter here.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not full of supporter, but I'm just saying kind of the difference between. It was just more. I think what made Liz Truss win that because all the MPs mostly voted for Rishi Sunak. I think what kind of it was just a way how she was catchy about cutting taxes. That's people's dream. That's you cut taxes, and the stuff was not economically wise, and it wasn't but it was so catchy for the public. So it's interesting to see the public kind of do they vote on catchy things you were mentioning about stuff like that. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I suppose this is also a period of time for Sunak where like it's like a boastful period.
Yeah.
because it's like,
Definitely.
hey,
I told you so.
I told you so.
like, I told you so. Like, why didn't you do it? And then now, like, it's had kind of a backlash toll, but then again, we don't know what Sunak would be as a prime minister and what side effects and stuff would be as well, because I'm sure he'll also have maybe as big as negatives as previous.
I mean, he still hasn't yet confirmed that he's going to be in the leadership race, but it's going to be an interesting one.
Let's put our predictions in, lads. Who do we think is the next prime minister?
Rishi Sunak.
You saying Sunak?
I think Rishi Sunak
What are
personally.
we saying? Sunak.
I think Sunak will take it.
Yeah, because it doesn't.
Should I follow the crowd and say Sunak, or should I throw a wild
Boris
card?
Johnson.
I'll say Jeremy Hunt will be the next prime minister.
Maybe, yeah. So, I mean, you never know with this Conservative.
Yeah,
party,
honestly, it is the most volatile political situation we're going through right now. You can't even guess anything.
I mean, personally, I did guess that Liz Truss was going to be prime minister. And as
Yeah.
here's the witness. I did know.
Wait, when did you? Where did you guess?
This was at the very beginning. This was the day Boris Johnson resigned.
Really?
Yeah, he
This
gets
is the
it.
day Boris Johnson
guessed
resigned.
Okay, you know what? All right.
So I mean,
I think
if so far I've
That's got to be a
correct.
fluke.
I don't think it's a fluke. You know, I think Rishi Sunak is the
I
next
think it's
one.
interesting.
He picked a
though.
name out of a hat.
Yeah.
Next week we'll see.
But I think it's interesting, definitely. And first brown prime minister coming from a background. So I was born and raised in, France. And
Oh, really?
yeah, so I was born and raised, and racism there is where you don't tend to see kind of Asians, brown people, kind of like in the top.
Mm.
And it's fascinating to see how there's the opportunity for first Asian prime minister.
Honestly, it would be a major historical moment.
I believe that should be an example to countries, like.
I mean, just think about it. So
That's just
is
crazy,
Sunak ethnically Indian?
I believe
Yeah.
So what's really ironic is that if he were to be prime minister, to think back to the history of British colonialism under India,
Yeah.
and now having an British Indian prime minister would be massive.
And it's not even that long ago.
How far do his values align with what is?
That's true. That's true.
I think it's difficult. The problem is,
I think physically, yeah, he represents.
Yeah, definitely.
He represents
It's-
the diverse nature of the country, but politically wise,
He is the richest
It's-
MP.
it's difficult because when you're talking about people like this in this way, it's difficult to sort of say he doesn't represent India. Okay, I'm not Indian, of course, but in this case, you could say, if I was to have a Palestinian Arab, and I would say he doesn't represent me because he doesn't believe in the same things I do. He's not part of me, and my group. He's not an Arab. He's not an Indian. He's not whatever. Because I disagree with his opinion. I think it's sort of difficult to sort of come from a point where you agree with what he's saying, and say yes. For example, if you don't come from an ethnic background, or in this case, I'm not Indian, and I was to say, why are Indians complaining? Look, you've got an Indian prime minister. I'd be very I think I'd be harsh with you. But at the same time, for Indians themselves to sort of say, Boris, Rishi Sunak doesn't represent us. He's not part of us. I think it's also, it's a bit. It doesn't. I don't think it comes from the right place. I think
can understand. I can understand.
You have to admit
Of course,
that.
yeah. that's true.
Whether you like it or not, he's a part of your community. That's what I would personally say.
Definitely, yeah.
Even if you disagree with him, if you don't think your interests are aligned, he's a part of your community. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to vote for him,
Of course, yeah.
but it does mean that you have to take that into account.
If Sunak were to become prime minister, then as we were talking about earlier about and previously when India and Britain were under the influence, it'll kind of like be a cycle of like historical events, because Sunak's wife, she has shares in Infosys, which is her her father's company. That company, I believe has links with the Indian government, which kind of then links the two countries together, which I find quite interesting.
It's it's not even that long ago. When you really think about it, you're talking, I believe, 1949.
Yeah.
47.
47 was partition.
I was thinking 1 year after 48. It's 1 year before 48. 48 is a very important
It's
year.
75 years ago.
Yeah, 75. That's nothing.
What's
That's
significant?
memory.
What's significant about 48?
48's the Nakba, the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians.
Oh yeah, my grandparents were still alive then.
Wow.
My
Well,
grandma was
this isn't even.
Definitely.
That's
It's not even that long
ago.
ago.
Yeah, so
It's not-
it is
it's not
like
Yeah, imagine if you were to go to say an Indian during the British colonial era, and we were to tell them in 70 years, during your lifetime, my friend, you will see an Indian head of state. Not technically,
yeah, but yeah,
you know, Indian in control of the UK. I don't think he'd believe you. And I think it's great to see that movement in time, that way that we are
the progression.
Yeah, I mean, it can show you like how much diversity and stuff can change in the UK over a short period of time. But then it kind of makes you feel like that period of time was so long ago, and that we've developed so much in such a long time, when it's just all been combined to less than a century, and that so much history has happened in a century, like both the world wars and all of that, and all of those events, the fall of like all the monarchies in Europe, and then it's all just led to this one like democratic Britain, how it is today, with people, so Indians and different cultures are all born in the UK that have the possibility in being head of parliament.
Yeah, I think it's a very telling thing. I know to what extent he's going to help Indian people and other minorities in the UK. I can't really say, but I will say that for once, right, if he becomes prime minister, which again I believe so, just to come back next week, not next week, perhaps the week after I come back. I told you so. But,
What's your own, by the way?
I don't know.
But we also did agree with you.
Yes.
We did.
Yeah.
So we also claimed this win.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair. But I think, you know, for the first time, brown children will look up and they'll see, you know, someone who looks like them, who comes from a similar background.
Let's move away from this sort of idea of diversity and him being this sort of.
It's just identity politics.
Let's talk about his actual political ideals. What do you think about them? Because, like we mentioned before, will he actually benefit the working class? Let's say, for example.
Yeah, I mean, this is inherently a political issue, but I think it's very telling. Like how I just was defending him, I must say now, I do very strongly disagree with him.
I mean, wasn't there that video that him saying, we were having this conversation before, that he wants to, I don't know what his exact words, but it was something along, I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines of taking money out of deprived urban areas and putting them into already rich areas.
I mean, I'm Indian too, but I don't necessarily I don't really think I agree as much as other people think that I would with Sunak in what he stands for.
I think Rishi Sunak's policies are, like, especially the ones for right now, it's because his main, especially during the campaign, you know, when we're choosing the leader of the Conservative Party, it was interesting because he was more focused on cutting inflation and she was focused on more cutting taxation. And it's interesting to see because Rishi Sunak's approach, you know, that, as I said, the last few, you know, like economically makes more sense, because if you tackle inflation, what's going to happen is you'll see that in the mortgage, because, you know, what Lizz Truss is basically more spending in the economy. And then, you know, interest rates are going to go higher and higher because when inflation goes up, interest rates go higher. And then this is to say that there's people in this country where there's variable rates mortgages. So their mortgage going up, their energy bills. And then Rishi Sunak was more focused on inflation, getting that battle down. And then when you focus on that, then that would not make such a big effect on, you know, like mortgage rates, all that stuff. So it's interesting to see the contrast of it. He was more focusing on inflation more than taxation. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not an economist, and you know, Isaac here studied economics, and you know, I trusted his judgment to an extent, but you know, none of us here are experts.
Definitely.
I think the important thing here is that what are their proposed aims, right? And I think what was mentioned, where he said the quote, and I've got the exact quote here. And he says, we inherited a bunch of formulas from Labour that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. And that needed to be undone. Now, what I hear when I hear that, you know, when I see that,
He's supposed to help his mates out.
You know, but, you know, Luton is a deprived urban area in many respects. Yeah. Well, he's telling me when he says that. Of course, he didn't say that to me or anyone in a deprived urban area. He said that to his, you know, to Tunbridge Wells, which is a Conservative safe seat, but he said, you know, he's saying he's going to undo the extra funding that we've gotten as Luton. I don't. That's what he's told me he's going to do, right? So if I'm going to take that and somehow ignore it and say, look, his economic policies are for me, I think it's quite naive of us.
I think maybe that was probably in hindsight probably not the best thing for him to say,
Yeah.
because it's not really going to help him
Definitely.
become more popular, is it? But we've had a good conversation today about many things, about the Conservative Party, Labour, Keir Starmer calling for a general election. Listeners, please do let us know what you think. 07779 481822. You can message. We'll definitely read those messages, all of us today. And just in general, let you know what you've thought about this show. We've got around 30 seconds left. It's been a very good conversation. Any final thoughts?
Lizz Truss out.
I hope a general election happens. I mean, we'll see what happens next week, but it will be a good show next week.
A very, very good show.
Yeah, it should be a good show.
Yeah,
we hope to have all of you guys joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your invitation, guys. Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's been
Had Isaac here on the show for the first
Yeah,
time.
great guest.
I'll
Great
definitely
guest.
come back.
Great host as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
We'd love to have you back, Isaac.
That's fine.
Love to have all of you back. So, listeners, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.